At 35,000 feet, the air is so thin and so cold that bare skin can freeze solid in under a minute. A radio operator named Nelson King took off his gloves anyway, because the only way to save a dying friend was with his own bare hands. What happened to those hands, and to the airplane that carried his name into the deadliest sky over Berlin, is one of the most harrowing true stories to ever come out of the 8th Air Force. Chapter 1. 30 seconds to live 35,000 feet above northern Germany. The world is not a place a human body was ever meant to survive unprotected. The air up here is so thin that a man breathing it directly would lose consciousness in under a minute. The temperature outside the aircraft's thin aluminum skin sits at 60 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, cold enough that exposed, wet skin can freeze solid, can die, can turn to dead white tissue in a matter of seconds, not minutes. Every man riding in a B-17 Flying Fortress at this altitude is wrapped in electrically heated suits. Thick fleece-lined gloves, oxygen masks clamped tight to his face, breathing through hoses connected to tanks that are, quite literally, the only thing standing between him and death by suffocation. Now imagine one of those oxygen systems failing. Imagine a crewman, somewhere in the freezing, deafening, shuddering belly of that aircraft, silently losing consciousness, because the air he is breathing has simply stopped coming. Imagine another crewman finding him, and understanding, in the space of a single heartbeat, that the only way to save him is to strip off his own gloves and work with his bare hands, in cold that can kill exposed flesh in under a minute, for as long as it takes. There is no margin for hesitation up here, no time to think it through, no second attempt if the first one fails. A man's hands at 60 below stop working his hands within moments of exposure. The fine motor control needed to work a small metal buckle or a stiff rubber hose vanishes almost immediately, well before the true lasting damage even begins. And still, somewhere over the flat, frozen farmland of northern Germany, in the belly of a shuddering, flak-scared bomber, thousands of miles from anything resembling safety, a decision has to be made in less time than it takes to read this sentence. That is not a hypothetical. That is exactly what happened. On a return flight from the German port city of Bremen, in the closing weeks of 1943, to a young radio operator from Kansas named Nelson King. What he did in the next 20 minutes would cost him his hands. It would also save his crewmates' lives, earn a B-17 bomber a new name, and set the stage for one of the most harrowing single missions ever flown by the United States 8th Air Force, a mission in which that very same airplane, now carrying King's name painted on its nose, would be torn apart in the skies over Berlin, and somehow, against every reasonable expectation, brought home anyway. This is that story, Chapter 2, The Bloody 100th. To understand what these men were flying into, you first need to understand the campaign, and the unit they belonged to. By late 1943, the United States 8th Air Force has committed itself to one of the most controversial and costly strategies of the entire Second World War, daylight precision bombing. While the British Royal Air Force conducts its own bombing campaign against Germany almost exclusively at night, relying on darkness for protection, American commanders insist on a different approach, flying enormous formations of heavily armed four-engine bombers deep into the heart of Nazi-controlled Europe in broad daylight, using the Norden bomb site to strike specific industrial targets with what planners hope will be surgical precision. Aircraft factories, ball-bearing plants, oil refineries, submarine pens, the sinews and organs of the German war machine. It is a strategy built on a theory that, in practice, exacts an appalling price. Daylight formations are visible for miles. German fighter controllers can see them coming, vector interceptors to meet them, and hit them again and again along hundreds of miles of approach and withdrawal. German flak batteries, dense and accurate around every major target, fill the sky with bursting shells that riddle aircraft with shrapnel. The bomber crew's own defense, massed, interlocking machine gun fire from tight defensive formations helps, but it cannot stop determined fighter pilots, willing to press attacks to point-blank range, sometimes closing to mere yards before breaking away, sometimes not breaking away at all. No single unit within the 8th Air Force comes to embody the cost of this strategy more than the 100th Bomb Group, based at Thorpe Abbott's airfield in the flat farm country of Norfolk, England. By the winter of 1943, the 100th has already suffered such catastrophic, repeated losses on its deep penetration missions into Germany that other crews across the 8th Air Force have started calling it by a grim nickname that will follow it for the rest of the war, and long after, the Bloody 100th. It is not an exaggeration, and it is not dramatic license. On certain missions, the group loses aircraft and crews at a rate that borders on the incomprehensible. Entire squadrons wiped out in a single afternoon. Entire barracks left empty by evening. Entire messes where a man simply stopped setting a place because the crew that used to sit there did not come home. Statistically, over the course of the war, a bomber crewman flying with the 8th Air Force in this period has worse odds of surviving his full tour of missions than an infantryman in many ground combat roles. For the men of the 100th Bomb Group specifically, those odds are worse still. The nickname is barely a month old by the time King's Crew flies its 9th mission, and it was earned in the bluntest way imaginable. During a single catastrophic stretch of days in October 1943, a period airmen of the 8th Air Force came to call Black Week, the 100th Bomb Group is sent, on the 10th of that month, against the German city of Münster. 13 B-17s take off from Thorpe Abbott's that morning. German fighters meet them in overwhelming numbers, making head-on passes, wave after wave into the low squadron of the formation, tearing the group apart in a matter of minutes. Of the 13 aircraft that left English soil, 12 are shot down. Only one makes it home, a battered B-17 named the Royal Flush, flown by Lieutenant Robert Rosie Rosenthal, limping back across the North Sea, carrying wounded men, and the sole surviving account of what had just happened in the sky over Munster. When Rosenthal later reports the scale of the destruction to divisional headquarters, witnesses recall the room falling utterly silent, the kind of silence, one officer would say afterward, in which you could have heard a pin drop. Across that single 3-day stretch of Black Week, the 8th Air Force as a whole loses 88 B-17s and very nearly 900 men. It is the single bloodiest week the 100th Bomb Group will ever experience, and it is the week that permanently welds the nickname Bloody 100th onto the unit's identity for the rest of the war, and for every history written about it afterward. This is the world that Nelson King, a farm boy from Kansas serving as a radio operator, and his crewmates, Lieutenant Frank Loro in the pilot's seat, a young man who, before the war, had been the youngest member ever admitted to the New York Stock Exchange, co-pilot Joe Griesemar, an Ohio farm boy who used to race midget cars before he learned to fly 4-engine bombers, ball turret gunner Murray Schreier, the son of a hotel worker, top turret gunner Dewey Thompson from North Carolina, waist gunner Bill Heathman from Warren, Ohio, navigator Emery Horvath, and bombardier Walt Green belonged to 9 young men, most of them barely out of their teens, climbing into an unpressurized, unheated aluminum tube every few days and flying it into some of the most heavily defended airspace on the planet. By late November 1943, this crew has already flown 8 combat missions together. On their 9th, everything nearly falls apart at 35,000 feet, and it has nothing to do with enemy fighters or flak at all. Chapter 3, Bremen, and the Cold That Kills. From the inside, the target on this particular mission is Bremen, a major German port city and industrial center on the North Sea coast, a frequent and heavily defended target for 8th Air Force raids throughout the war. The bomb run itself goes as these missions go, flak bursting in ugly black smudges around the formation. The tension of holding a straight and level course through the target area, so the bombardier can do his job. The relief, however brief, of finally seeing the bomb bay doors close and the formation turn for home. Inside the aircraft, conversation is impossible without the intercom. The drone of 4 Wright Cyclone engines is a constant, bone-deep roar that never stops for the entire 8 or 9-hour round trip. Every man aboard is sealed inside his own private, freezing world, goggles fogging and unfogging, oxygen mask fogging with every breath, electrically heated suits fighting a losing battle against a cold that finds its way in through every seam and gap in the fabric. It is, in its own way, one of the loneliest forms of combat fought in the entire war, men sitting essentially alone at their stations, unable to see most of their own crewmates, entirely dependent on a tangle of hoses, wires, and electrical connections, simply to remain alive long enough to do their jobs. It is on the return leg, still deep over enemy or contested territory, still locked at 35,000 feet in air, that will kill an unprotected man in under a minute, that the real crisis begins, down in the cramped, freezing ball turret slung beneath the belly of the aircraft. One of the loneliest, most claustrophobic positions on the entire airplane, a plexiglass bubble barely large enough for one curled-up man and his twin machine guns. Ball turret gunner Murray Shrier's portable oxygen supply begins to fail. The mechanism of the failure is as simple as it is deadly. At 60 below zero, moisture from a crewman's own breath, exhaled again and again into an oxygen mask and its connecting tubes over the course of hours, can condense and freeze solid inside the very system meant to keep him alive. Ice crystals build up in the regulator, in the hose, in the mask itself, gradually choking off the flow of oxygen until there is none left at all. Shrier, alone in his cramped plexiglass bubble beneath the aircraft, begins to suffocate at 10 kilometers above the earth. He does what training tells him to do. He tries to get out, tries to reach help, tries to crawl out of the turret and back into the fuselage toward the radio room, where another crewman might notice him and get him onto the aircraft's main oxygen system before it's too late. He makes it partway. He does not make it all the way. Somewhere around the doorway into the radio compartment, deprived of oxygen for too long already, Murray Shrier collapses, unconscious, right at the threshold, so close to help, and so far from it, in the few seconds that separate survival from death at this altitude. And it does not stop with him. As the crisis unfolds, other members of the crew begin losing consciousness from their own frozen or failing oxygen lines. Co-pilot Joe Greasamore and waist gunners Bill Heathman and Gerald Will all go down within the same terrible stretch of minutes, the aircraft's interior turning, in the space of what feels like no time at all, into a scene of multiple men slumped unconscious in the freezing dark. Their lives measured now, not in hours or minutes, but in the handful of seconds. Their brains can survive without oxygen before the damage becomes irreversible and then fatal. Radio operator Nelson King is one of the few still conscious. And what he does next is the reason this story is still being told more than 80 years later. Chapter 4. The bare hands King finds Shrier collapsed in the doorway to the radio room, not breathing properly, dying in front of him. He needs to get an oxygen mask sealed properly onto Shrier's face, connected to a working line. Immediately, there is no time to think, no time to improvise a slower solution, no time to do anything except act. And here is the problem that turns an ordinary emergency into the defining moment of King's life. The fittings on the oxygen mask, the couplings and connectors that need to be manipulated quickly and precisely to get a fresh line secured, are small, stiff, and half-frozen themselves. King's hands are sheathed in thick, fleece-lined flying gloves, essential for survival at 60 below zero, and utterly useless for the kind of fine, fast, exact manipulation this crisis demands. He tries. The gloves are simply too bulky. His fingers, thickly padded and clumsy inside layers of insulation, cannot get the mask properly seated, cannot work the small metal fittings fast enough, and Shrier is dying in front of him while he fumbles. So Nelson King makes a decision that, viewed from any reasonable distance, should not be survivable. He takes off his gloves. At 60 degrees below zero, at 35,000 feet, with bare skin directly exposed to air, cold enough to damage living tissue in under a minute, King goes to work with his naked hands, securing Shrier's mask, getting oxygen flowing back into his lungs. Then moving on to the other unconscious crewmen, Griesemar and Heathman and Will, doing the same desperate work for each of them in turn, freeing frozen fittings, forcing stiff couplings into place, making sure that every man who has gone down is breathing again before it is too late for him too. He does this for approximately 20 minutes, not 20 seconds, not the 60-second window that flight surgeons would later cite as roughly how long human skin can be exposed to cold like this before serious, permanent damage begins. 20 full minutes, moving from man to man, working stiff frozen mechanisms with fingers that are themselves freezing solid in real time. Because stopping means someone on this aircraft dies, and King has made the decision instantly, instinctively, without anyone ordering him to, that his hands are the price he is willing to pay to prevent that. By the time he finishes, every crewman who went down from oxygen failure is breathing again. Every one of them survives. Nelson King does not. Not in the sense that he dies, he doesn't. Not that day, not for decades afterward. But something in those 20 minutes is taken from him permanently, as circulation attempts to return to hands that have been frozen through and through. King begins thrashing in pain, and witnesses later recall something almost impossible to process. Bits of frozen flesh flaking away from his fingers like chunks of ice breaking off, the tissue destroyed beyond any hope of recovery. Pilot Frank Laro, watching what King has just done to save Schreyer's life, will later put it as simply and as devastatingly as it can be put. King saved Schreyer's life with those hands. The aircraft makes it back to England. Nelson King is rushed into medical care, and over the following weeks and months, surgeons are forced to amputate, first the frostbitten, dead tissue, and ultimately every finger and thumb on both of his hands. The damage from those 20 minutes at 60 below zero simply too total, too far beyond saving, for anything less. Chapter 5. A name painted on the nose. For his actions on that mission, Nelson King is awarded the Silver Star, one of the United States military's highest decorations for gallantry in action. A formal, official acknowledgement of what everyone on that aircraft already knows in their bones. That King chose, in the space of a single decision made under impossible pressure, to sacrifice his own body rather than let his crewmates die around him. The crew does something else too, something that has nothing to do with official citations or medal ceremonies. When it comes time to give their B-17 a name, the personal nose art, and christening that so many bomber crews used to mark their aircraft as their own, part talisman, part tribute, part simple defiant assertion of identity, in a war that seemed determined to grind every one of them down into a statistic. There is no debate about what that name should be. They painted on the nose in bold letters, Nelson King. It is a way of doing something that no medal ceremony, however solemn, can quite accomplish. It puts King's name, and everything that name now stands for, on the very aircraft his crewmates will keep flying into combat, mission after mission, for as long as their tour requires. Every time that B-17 lifts off the runway at Thorpe Abbotts, every time it climbs to altitude and points east toward Germany, it carries the name of the man who gave his hands to keep his crew alive. For the men flying it, that is not a small thing. It is a promise of sorts, that whatever happens next, they are not going to let that name go down easily. They have no way of knowing, in that moment, just how literally that promise is about to be tested. Because a little more than 3 months later, on the 6th of March, 1944, the B-17 named Nelson King is going to fly directly into one of the most catastrophic single missions the 8th Air Force has ever launched, a mission that will very nearly prove that a name painted on an airplane's nose means nothing at all against 20mm cannon shells and a swarm of German fighters with a 20-mile gap in the American formation to exploit. Chapter 6. The biggest target of the war, March 6, 1944, is a date that belongs among the grimmest in the entire history of the 8th Air Force. The target, for the first time in a truly massive, committed daylight raid, is Berlin itself, the Nazi capital, the political and symbolic heart of the Third Reich, and one of the most heavily defended cities on the face of the earth. ringed with flak batteries and covered by some of the most experienced fighter units the Luftwaffe still has left. The scale of the operation is staggering. Nearly 1,500 American aircraft, bombers and their fighter escorts combined, take part in the raid, one of the largest single air operations mounted by the United States up to that point in the war. Among them, 21 B-17s of the 100th Bomb Group form the lead squadron of Combat Wing 13B, and out in front of that formation leading the way is the aircraft now known simply as the Nelson King. There have been changes to the crew since Bremen. Captain Jack Swartout, a pilot with previous experience flying P-47 Thunderbolt fighters before transitioning to heavy bombers, has come aboard as co-pilot, replacing Joe Griesemar in that seat. Griesemar himself has not left the aircraft. He has simply moved to the tail gunner's position, taking up a role he has had essentially no formal training for, because on a bomber crew in the winter of 1944, you go where you are needed, training or no training. Everything about the mission's opening hours suggests it is going to be an unusually large, unusually dangerous operation, but nobody aboard the Nelson King yet knows just how badly the day's plan is about to unravel, or how directly that unraveling is about to put their aircraft in the crosshairs of over 100 German fighters at once. Chapter 7. The gap in the sky formation flying at its core is what keeps American daylight bomber crews alive. A tight, disciplined combat box, with dozens of aircraft flying close enough together to concentrate their defensive machine gun fire into overlapping fields, is a genuinely difficult target for an attacking fighter to approach without running a gauntlet of return fire from a dozen directions at once. Break that formation apart, scatter it, thin it out, isolate individual aircraft or small groups from the protective mass, and the entire calculus of survival changes instantly and catastrophically. On the 6th of March 1944, over northern Germany, that is exactly what happens to Combat Wing 13B. Navigation errors, compounded by weather and by problems with the radar equipment aboard the lead Pathfinder aircraft, responsible for guiding the formation, cause the wing to drift off course and separate from the rest of the bomber stream. A gap opens up, not a small one, not a minor deviation that closes itself within a few minutes, but a genuine 20-mile hole in the sky between Combat Wing 13B and the protective mass of the larger bomber formation, and crucially, between Combat Wing 13B and the fighter escorts that are supposed to be shielding it from exactly the kind of attack that is about to come. Every bomber crewman in the 8th Air Force knows this equation instinctively, because it is drilled into them at every briefing. Stay in formation, and you have a fighting chance. Fall out of formation, whether through battle damage or navigational error, and you become the weakest animal at the edge of the herd. Fighter escort makes the equation even starker. American long-range escort fighters, by the spring of 1944, increasingly capable P-51 Mustangs alongside the P-47s and P-38s, exist for exactly one purpose on a mission like this: to be in the right patch of sky at the right moment to meet German interceptors before they ever reach the bombers. When the escort is somewhere else, for any reason, the bombers underneath that empty patch of sky are, for all practical purposes, undefended. German fighter controllers on the ground, watching all of this unfold on radar, do not need to be told twice what a 20-mile gap in an American bomber formation, with no escort in sight, actually means. It means opportunity, and the Luftwaffe responds to that opportunity with everything it has left to throw at it. Roughly 107 Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s, converging on the isolated, exposed bombers of Combat Wing 13B, including the 21 B-17s of the 100th Bomb Group flying at its head, including the Nelson King, leading the way, now flying essentially alone against odds that no formation of unescorted heavy bombers was ever designed to survive. Chapter 8. The first wave, what happens next, unfolds with a speed and a violence that is difficult to fully convey in words. But the bare arithmetic of it is brutal enough on its own. In the very first wave of the German attack, 10 B-17s go down, 10 aircraft, each one carrying a crew of 10 men, torn out of the formation and sent falling toward the earth below in the space of a few catastrophic minutes. Of the 9 remaining bombers still flying in the high squadron of the formation, 6 are trailing flames as German fighters press home attack after attack, diving through the formation, firing, breaking away, and diving back in again. This is the environment the Nelson King is flying through when its own turn comes. A Focke-Wulf W190 comes in on an attack run that ends not with a clean pass and a breakaway, but with an actual physical collision, the German fighter striking the Nelson King's vertical fin and rudder, tearing a gash through the tail structure of the bomber, before spinning away, whether by design or by a pilot who simply misjudged his closing speed in the chaos of the fight. The damage to the tail is bad enough on its own. What comes next is worse. A Messerschmitt Bf-109 lines up a firing pass and puts a 20mm cannon shell directly into the cockpit of the Nelson King. The explosion inside that confined space is devastating. It obliterates the instrument panel in front of the pilots, ruptures hydraulic lines and sends scalding hot fluid spraying through the cockpit, and starts a fire right there, inches from the men trying to keep the aircraft flying. Jack Swartout, in the co-pilot's seat, is drenched in the spray from the ruptured lines, and for one gut-dropping instant is certain he has been hit himself, that the warm liquid soaking through his flight suit is his own blood, before he realizes, with a strange mixture of relief and horror, that it is hydraulic fluid, not blood, and that whatever has just happened to the aircraft around him, he himself is still for the moment alive and unwounded. The aircraft is now losing 2 engines, a fuel tank has been pierced by cannon fire, an oil cooler line has been damaged. The ball turret and top turret positions have both been compromised in the attack. The Nelson King's maximum airspeed, in an aircraft that needs speed to have any hope of staying with a protective formation, has been reduced to barely 140 miles an hour, a crawl, by the standards of aerial combat, that makes it an even easier target for any German fighter that wants to come back and finish the job. By any reasonable measure, this is the moment where a crew bails out, if they can, and takes their chances as prisoners of war on the ground, rather than ride a dying aircraft the rest of the way through hostile airspace. It is exactly the kind of moment military doctrine, common sense, and simple survival instinct all point toward the same conclusion. Jack Swartout refuses to accept that conclusion. Chapter 9. The airplane that would not be allowed to fall. There is a specific, chilling reason why bailing out over Germany in a still flyable, however badly damaged, American bomber is a particularly grim proposition in the spring of 1944, beyond the obvious danger to the crew themselves. The Luftwaffe, throughout this period of the war, has a documented practice of pressing captured or forced down American B-17s into their own clandestine service, restoring them just enough to fly, repainting them, and using them as decoys, flying them in among genuine American bomber formations to gather intelligence, or using them to lure unsuspecting American aircraft into range of a trap. An intact B-17, abandoned by its crew and landed more or less in one piece on German soil, is not just a loss. It is a potential weapon that could eventually be turned against other American airmen. Jack Swartout knows this, and as he takes hold of the controls of an aircraft that has just had its cockpit shredded by a 20mm shell, lost 2 engines, and been reduced to a top speed that makes it easy prey for anything that wants to come finish it off, he makes a decision that will define the rest of this mission. He is not going to let the airplane carrying Nelson King's name go down intact into German hands. Not while there is any chance at all, of getting it home instead. Drawing on skills honed flying nimble, high-performance P-47 Thunderbolt fighters, before he ever set foot in a lumbering 4-engine bomber, Swartout begins doing something that a B-17 pilot is not really supposed to be able to do with a crippled aircraft. He flies it aggressively. He weaves, banks, and maneuvers the damaged bomber down and alongside the formation of the 390th Bomb Group, tucking in, close enough to borrow whatever protective cover their defensive gunfire can offer. Using every scrap of altitude and airspeed the wounded aircraft has left to keep it moving, keep it unpredictable. Keep it just difficult enough a target that the German fighters, circling for another kill, find easier prey elsewhere. In the tale, Joe Griesemar, the man who started this mission's cycle of near disasters back at Bremen months earlier, and who is now manning a gun position he was never formally trained for, keeps firing at pursuing fighters for so long, and so continuously that his machine guns become too hot to touch. He will later write to his parents that the heat pouring off the barrels was causing rounds to cook off and fire on their own, the guns essentially discharging themselves from residual heat because he simply will not stop feeding them ammunition and pulling the trigger. The aircraft is in such visibly rough shape, weaving so erratically through the sky, trailing smoke and flame from multiple points of damage, that other American bomber crews nearby genuinely begin to wonder whether it might actually be a captured B-17 now flown by a German crew. Exactly the nightmare scenario Swartout is fighting so hard to prevent from ever becoming true. The confusion only clears when a badly damaged American P-38 Lightning fighter, itself limping home from the same catastrophic engagement, pulls in alongside the Nelson King's left wing, flying close formation with it, in effect vouching for it, signaling to every other American aircraft and gun crew, watching that this ragged, smoking, barely controllable bomber is still one of theirs. Chapter 10. Limping home somehow, through a combination of Swartout's fighter-honed flying skill, Griesemar's relentless defensive fire from the tail, sheer structural stubbornness on the part of the airframe itself, and no small amount of luck, the Nelson King survives the flight back across the North Sea and makes it to England, landing with only 2 crewmen suffering minor wounds. Given everything that aircraft absorbed over the skies of Germany that day, a mid-air collision with an enemy fighter, a 20mm shell detonating inside the cockpit, the loss of 2 engines, ruptured hydraulics, a fire, a top speed cut to a crawl, that outcome is close to miraculous. It is not, however, an outcome shared by most of the formation the Nelson King was flying with. Of the 21 B-17s of the 100th Bomb Group that took off that morning as the lead squadron of Combat Wing 13B, 11 failed to return. 11 aircraft, each one representing a crew of up to 10 men, lost in a single mission, a toll that works out to 43 men killed and 57 more taken prisoner, from the 100th Bomb Group alone. Across the entire 8th Air Force, the March 6, 1944, raid on Berlin cost 69 bombers and 11 fighter escorts shot down, and the 100th Bomb Group as a whole loses 150 crewmen on that single, catastrophic day. Joe Griesemar's letter home captures the scale of what they had just survived in a single understated sentence. This, he wrote, was the closest we ever came to not coming back. For his actions bringing the crippled Nelson King home rather than abandoning it, and, by extension, refusing to let it become another captured American bomber flying under a false flag. Jack Swartout is awarded the Silver Star, the same decoration given to Nelson King himself for what he did over Bremen 3 months earlier. 2 silver stars, earned by 2 different men on the same aircraft, for 2 entirely different kinds of courage. One an act of split-second, self-sacrificing medical rescue at the cost of his own hands, the other an act of sustained, skillful, stubborn flying that refused to let a dying airplane become a German trophy. Chapter 11. Lucky Bastards. Not long after the Berlin mission, the original crew that had flown together since Bremen, Frank Lauro, Murray Schreier, Dewey Thompson, Bill Heathman, Emery Horhaveth, Walt Green, and the others who had lived through both the oxygen crisis and the disaster over Berlin, complete their full combat tour in early April 1944. It is an achievement that, given everything already recounted here, should not be understated. Surviving a complete tour of missions with the Bloody 100th, in this specific stretch of the air war, was genuinely rare. The men who managed it earned themselves informal membership in what airmen of the period wryly called the Lucky Bastard Club, a half-joking, half-reverent acknowledgement that finishing a tour in this unit, in this period of the war, owed at least as much to luck as it did to skill. Murray Schreier, the ball turret gunner, whose frozen oxygen system had started this entire chain of events back over Bremen, the man Nelson King's bare hands had kept alive, does not stop there. He goes on to fly 26 additional combat missions in Italy, eventually amassing a career total of 52 missions, and earning himself the nickname Double Lucky Bastard. Among his peers, a man who by any statistical measure of this war should not have survived nearly as much combat flying as he ultimately did. Nelson King himself, meanwhile, is fighting a very different kind of battle back in the United States, the long, grinding process of learning to live without fingers, or thumbs on either hand. Surgeons, working with what tissue remains, perform a series of operations designed to give him at least some functional use of his hands, ultimately splitting tissue between the bones of his middle and ring fingers on each hand to create a crude but workable pincer grip, enough, remarkably, to allow him to write, to grip tools, and eventually even to drive a car. King settles afterward in Nebraska, where he takes up farming, and in a detail that says a great deal about the character of the man who once tore off his gloves at 60 degrees below zero to save a friend, goes on to found a church in his community. Those who knew him in the decades that follow consistently describe a man who carried what happened to him not with bitterness, but with a kind of quiet, settled peace. Chapter 12. The airplane's last flight, the B-17 Nelson King, though, is not finished with the war. Even after the crew whose story gave it its name moves on. Damaged but repairable after the mauling it took on March 6th, the aircraft is patched up, restored to flying condition, and handed over to a new crew to continue the war the original crew had survived. Under a new pilot, Lieutenant Ehil J. Stewart, the Nelson King returns to combat operations over occupied Europe. It's luck, however, the luck that had carried it home from Berlin trailing fire and smoke, weaving alongside a borrowed formation with a wounded P-38 as an escort, finally runs out on the 24th of May, 1944. On a mission deep into Germany, near the town of Wittstock, the aircraft that had once cheated destruction so dramatically is finally shot down for good. 3 of the crew aboard that day are killed. The remaining 7 are taken prisoner. It is a quiet, almost anticlimactic end for an aircraft that had, months earlier, become something close to a legend within its own group, the plane that carried a hero's name, that had been torn open by cannon fire over the German capital, and somehow brought home anyway. War does not, in the end, make exceptions for the aircraft that have already earned their story. Sooner or later, in a conflict that consumed bombers and crews at the rate the daylight air war over Germany did, almost everything eventually goes down. The Nelson King simply lasted longer and survived more than almost anyone had any right to expect before its number finally came up. Epilogue. What the name carried, step back from the individual missions, the individual dates, and look at what this story actually adds up to. It is, at its heart, 2 acts of courage separated by 3 months and connected by a single airplane and a single name painted on its nose. The first act belongs to Nelson King, a young radio operator who, faced with a dying crewmate and a piece of frozen equipment his gloves could not manipulate fast enough, made an instant decision to sacrifice his own hands rather than lose even the few seconds it would have cost to hesitate. He was not ordered to remove his gloves. Nobody would have blamed him if he hadn't, if Schreier and the others had died before help could reach them in some other way. He chose it anyway, in real time, at 60 degrees below zero, with no way of knowing in the moment just how permanent the cost would be, and he kept working for 20 full minutes, moving from man to man, because stopping meant someone else on that aircraft was going to die. The second act belongs to Jack Swartout and to Joe Griesemar in the tailgun position, and in a real sense to the entire crew flying an airplane that carried a name they had all chosen to honor. Faced with a shredded cockpit, a fire, 2 dead engines, and every reasonable justification in the world to order a bailout over enemy territory, Swartout instead chose to fly that dying aircraft home, refusing to let the name Nelson King become the name on a German decoy aircraft used to hunt down other American crews. It was not the safe choice. It was, by any conventional measure, the harder and riskier choice, and it worked, against odds that 11 other crews flying in that same formation that same day did not beat. Both men received the Silver Star. Both decisions, in their own way, were about refusing to accept the easier, more survivable option when someone else's life, or something close to a sacred obligation to a name and everything it represented, was on the line. The airplane itself did not survive the war. Most of the men who flew it, remarkably, did. Nelson King lived on for decades afterward in Nebraska, farming, building a church, raising a family, carrying what those 20 minutes at 60 below zero had cost him without, by every account, ever once seeming to regret the choice that caused it. Somewhere in that quiet, hard-won peace is the real ending to this story, not the wreckage near Wittstock, not the medals, not even the raw numbers of the Berlin mission, staggering as they are, but the simple fact that a man who gave up his hands to save his friends went on to build an entire life afterward, and never once, as far as anyone who knew him could tell, wished he had chosen differently. It is a story that very nearly stayed buried in unit records and yellowing newspaper clippings, the way so many stories from the Bloody Hundredth did for decades after the war. One more crew, one more mission, one more act of extraordinary courage folded into a unit history so dense with tragedy and heroism that individual stories could easily be lost inside it. In more recent years, the wider legend of the 100th Bomb Group, the same unit, the same airfield at Thorpe Abbotts, the same string of catastrophic missions that began with Black Week in October 1943, has reached a far larger audience than it ever had during the men's own lifetimes. Dramatized for television and revisited in documentaries and books that have introduced an entirely new generation to just how costly and just how strange and human the daylight air war over Germany really was. Nelson King and Jack Swartout are not the most famous names to come out of that unit's history. But their story, a radio operator's bare hands against 60 below zero cold, and a fighter pilot's stubborn refusal to let a wounded bomber die with dignity intact rather than fall into enemy hands, belongs at the very center of what made the Bloody Hundredth's reputation what it is. Not simply a record of catastrophic losses, but a record of what ordinary young men, thrown into circumstances almost too extreme to comprehend, were willing to do for one another when it mattered most. That is the story of the 8th Air Force, and the Bloody Hundredth, and a battered B-17 with a hero's name on its nose, left behind.